All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. We're just having some technical difficulties. I am not Diana. I am Nikita, but I'll just go ahead and introduce the first session for this afternoon, which is called AR and VR. And the first paper that we're going to be presenting is presented by Johann Wentzel, and it's called Improving Virtual Reality Ergonomics Through Reach-Bounded Nonlinear Input Amplification.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm Johann Wentzel, and I'm going to be presenting Improving Virtual Reality Ergonomics Through Reach-Bounded Nonlinear Input Amplification. I did this with my friend Greg and my advisor Dan, and let's just jump right into it. So, one of the fundamental open problems with virtual reality is the mismatch between the physical and the virtual. This was a problem with motion control technologies like the Wii, as well as the Kinect that has you jumping around your room, and now once again with VR. So movement can be challenging in applications like this due to mobility requirements, fatigue, or even just having too small of a play area. In many cases, the user's physical body can get in the way, either through health restrictions or even just bumping into things. Shocker for the day, motion controls are always going to need some amount of motion to work, and as such we need to compensate either in our spaces or in our movement techniques. So a typical remedy to this is input amplification, in which smaller, more comfortable movements are transformed into the larger, more dramatic movements. Previous work suggests that the maximum of the real and the VR hands should differ is roughly 20% of the user's arm length to preserve immersion. This presents an opportunity to prioritize increased comfort while still maintaining immersion. So here's a preview of our technique that proposes a few fixes to this. It amplifies the user's motion along a smooth, non-linear curve, which allows us to make reaching in VR more comfortable while still keeping the user's sense of body ownership. So, previous work for this falls into two camps: target-dependent and target-independent techniques. Target-independent techniques often increase comfort at the expense of body ownership, while target-dependent techniques maintain body ownership but aren't applicable to larger varieties of tasks. This presents a unique opportunity to create a technique that provides both the comfort benefits of target-independent techniques as well as the body ownership focus of target-dependent techniques. I'll get more into detail about these techniques next. So, first category of input amplification is target-independent techniques. The classical example is the go-go technique, which was presented in 1996 and is a two-part scaling algorithm. The first 2/3 of the user's reach functions normally, but then the remaining 1/3 is amplified exponentially. Next is Lee et al., who tested 4 different methods: no offset, which is regular motion; a linear offset, which is uniformly amplifying user motion; a fixed length offset, which is a constant offset, so users' hands were always more forward than they usually are; and then the go-go technique. They found that no offset is best when targets are in reach, and linear is best when targets are beyond reach. So these two techniques help the user move more comfortably. However, their implementations risk breaking the user's body ownership and thus reducing the user's feeling of immersion in the VR scene. We also have more ownership-friendly techniques in the related work. The first is ownership, which explore the interaction between hand amplification offsets and body ownership in VR using a virtual panel UI. So a key insight here is that gradual adjustment helps people not notice when you mess with their proprioception. Then we have Ergo, which created offsets more dynamically by segmenting the entirety of the user's reachable space into tetrahedrons, with the vertices of the tetrahedrons aligned with targets in the scene. As the user moved their hands between the tetrahedrons, the system would use optimization functions and simulated annealing to calculate the most ergonomic way to get to the intended target. Ergo significantly improved ergonomics with improvements of up to 7.2%. This work, while being implicitly designed to maintain the user's comfort while still amplifying the user's reach, seems to be the closest related work, and as such, our first experiment compares our experiment to Ergo. So both of these still need target positions in the scene to function. This makes them non-optimal for general use, as there are lots of applications that do not have targets in the scene, like painting or 3D modeling. We introduce a new input amplification method called reach-bounded nonlinear, or RNL, input amplification. This technique allows for more comfortable reaching movements, and unlike other methods, it does not reduce body ownership, and as well, it does not require targets to function. And the kicker here, some users may not even notice it happening. So here's the technique demo again. Notice that the VR and the real hands meet when the user extends their hand out fully and when it's back at their neutral point. How this works is that the computer infers the shoulder position, PS, the user calibrates their neutral resting point, PN, and their maximum reach, Pmax. Pmax defines a theoretical sphere of maximum reach around the user's body for that arm. Offsets are based on the neutral position and the controller's current position, which is turned into P star H, or the amplified point. So the computer gets the physical offset R from all of the points and uses R into an amplification function to calculate that new offset for P star H. This is what the calibration process looks like. They select a neutral, comfortable point near their body, and then they reach out as far as they can. So we did a pilot study with 5 people to rapidly assess what amplification curves should look like. We learned 2 things. So first is, curves need to be kept smooth to avoid discontinuities. Discontinuities or sudden changes in slope can cause the VR hand to jump instantly from one spot to another, breaking body ownership. And the next one was to prioritize a slope that is greater than 1. Slope less than 1 makes the VR hand move more slowly than the real hand, which ended up feeling really unpleasant and immediately broke body ownership. So here's what the amplification curves we developed as a result. So the first task worked like this. The user would begin by tapping the cube placed at their neutral point. They would then tap the 2 spheres highlighted in green. So we have 3 task layouts for this experiment. So the ergonomic layout places targets easily within arm's reach, which is 21% of their arm span away. The limits layout places targets at a fixed position at the limits of the user's reach, so 44% arm span away. And then the fixed layout places target at a position fixed in the world, so the user has to walk around. This is not centered to their shoulder like the previous layouts. And then target layouts all came from Ergo for a meta comparison. So for experiment 1, we have one objective. Does RNL perform similarly to Ergo? We have 3 amplification levels based on the 3 curves: none, no movement; low, which is a little bit of amplification; and high, which is more dramatic amplification. We have our 3 target layouts that I mentioned. We have our 30 trials, and we have 18 participants who ran the experiment. So for results for experiment 1. First off, for time to complete, we found no significant difference between any of the 3, so amplification didn't really make a difference. Next up, we measured their comfort. So we measured comfort using what's called the Rapid Upper Limb Assessment, or RULA. So RULA works by checking the angles of the user's shoulder, the user's elbow, and the user's wrist, giving an ergonomic score based on that. So from that measurement system, we found significant differences in the limits and the fixed layouts for both amplification styles. So there was a significant reduction in user discomfort based on this. Next up was physical path length. So this is just how much they are physically moving. We found that in all layouts, we reduced physical path length. So they were moving much less. So next is virtual path length. We found that we did also increase virtual path length in all layouts, suggesting that we're potentially overshooting in their movements thanks to the amplification. And next we ran a survey based on different questions for comfort, ease of reach, overstretching, sense of control, and body ownership. We found that in high amplification, the body ownership was generally lower than with none. This might suggest that high amplification can cause offsets that are near the recommended max limits, but 5.22 is still promising since it's still a relatively high score from 1 to 7. So, main takeaways from experiment 1. We found that the technique works as well as Ergo, the state-of-the-art. It significantly improves comfort by reducing RULA scores, and it does not significantly affect task completion speed. There were some significant costs to path length, meaning that their virtual hand, not their physical hand, moved more. But this raises a question. What about the in-between curves? So this naturally prompts experiment 2. So let's push this further. We're now looking for a gradual picture of amplification. How much can we amplify movements before some of the adverse effects that we saw in experiment 1 start happening? So let's test more gradual changes in amplification, as well as pushing amplification even further. So this was the task for experiment 2. Participants would click back and forth between a sphere at their comfortable point and a target somewhere in the space. So neutral point, target, neutral point, target. There were 3 layouts. There were the close body layout, the mid-range layout, and the far layout. I'll get more into those task layouts. So instead of 3 curves, we're now testing 10 different curves, making amplifications from 0% to 45% of the user's arm reach. So here are the layouts of targets in experiment 2. So purple targets were close to the user's body, blue were mid-range, and green were at their maximum reach, so close, mid, and far. So for our design, we had 10 amplification levels, that's the 10 curves, 5 blocks, 3 distances, near, mid, and far, 5 target positions at each distance, and we had 18 participants running the experiment. So for results, we found significant results for time. So mid-range targets had significantly worse times by amplification 6, and far targets became significantly worse at amplification 8. So this did cause users to take a little bit more time to select the targets. Next up is comfort, using Rula again. So comfort differences became significant at amplification 5 for close targets, amplification 4 for mid targets, and users were more comfortable at amplification 2 for far targets, meaning that the farther targets were away, the more that amplification benefits became apparent. So next, for error, there was no real trend in the data for error based on amplification, other than 2 small significant areas, which was amplification 2 for mid-range targets and amplification 8 for far targets. We found that for input amplification, significantly reduced physical movement for all target distances. So amp 1 for close, and then 2 and 3 for far. So however, it significantly increased virtual path lengths at all distances, with mid targets feeling it the most. Check out that difference in slope. So mid targets had a way higher trend for virtual path ratio as people were going on. Next up, we ran surveys about each amplification level without outright telling them that input amplification was happening. So first, there was no statistically significant results. However, we can still point at some interesting possible trends. So for the first chart, we found the affect started to get worse around amplification level 4, suggesting that they started to enjoy the task less once amplification got too strong. Where our next question asked them if they felt like they had a doubling of hands. The trend here was fairly constant, with a small worsening after amplification 4. Note that this legend is flipped. The good answer is to disagree, because they had 2 of the same hand here. Next up was that this was one of the main body ownership questions, and this results suggested that things got a little less convincing around amplification 4. This lines up with previous findings. Amplification 4 is a boost of 20% of the user's arm reach, which lines up to the previously established limits for body ownership. So then there were similar results for control. Things started to decline around amplification 4, so users start feeling like they had less control as amplification got more strong. So next up, we noticed that if people were going to notice amplification, they noticed by amplification 5. We asked users in the introductory study how often they play 3D video games. From this, we found a Spearman's rank correlation of -0.48, suggesting that people who regularly play video games notice amplification earlier than those who don't. So, main takeaways from experiment 2. Amplification strength and target distance both affect the usability. Amplification strength improves the comfort even in small amounts, and then the results suggest that enjoyment and body ownership both decline roughly around 20% of the user's arm reach. Let's get into some of the design recommendations. So first off, designers should consider what they'll have VR users be doing throughout their application. Will they be reaching more? Consider amplifying their movements. Do they require more precision at the mid-range of their reach? Consider not amplifying as much, since it'll be less accurate. Do they need a high level of body ownership? Consider their movements only amplifying up to 20% of their arm's length, since that's a typical breaking point suggested by both the related work and our study. Next up, consider the function. So hand offset is super important here. The separation between the real and the virtual hand can break body ownership if it's larger than 20% of arm's reach, and can reduce task performance past 30%. Slope is a big issue here. It determines the relative speed of the virtual hand compared to the real hand. Moving too slowly can feel immediately bad, while moving too fast can break body ownership. Task performance declined around 30% of arm's reach in our experiment at a maximum slope of 1.92, which is nearly double the real hand speed. Discontinuities are also important to consider. We kept our curves smooth to make sure that the virtual hand doesn't instantly jump from one place to the next. Our pilot study showed that this was a dead giveaway. So lastly, consider the person. Gaming makes people notice amplification much more quickly. Tailor your amplification to your intended audience. So, to summarize, reach-bounded nonlinear input can help users use VR more comfortably without changing their levels of immersion. We hope that these results can help future designers and researchers develop more comfortable VR applications. Thanks for watching.
Well, hello, Joanne. This is Diana here, and we'll be beginning the Q&A session.
Hey, how's it going?
Hello, Joanne. It's good. How's it going with you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad.
Okay, for the first question, I would like to know what is the most interesting part of your findings and why?
To be honest, from all of this, the question on whether or not people notice amplification happening was probably the most interesting finding, because there were actually two different data points that we were asking, like just when did people notice, and when did people notice, and when do people play video games, or how often do they? And there were two separate data points that we just ended up just combining just to see what happened, and we found like a really significant correlation. So noticing that that gamers notice amplification much more quickly was probably at least the most unexpected thing we found.
Good answer. For the second question, so you focused on amplifying movements. How could you modify it to support restricting movements instead? For example, for physical therapy. And do you think people would notice this?
So it's an interesting new application, right? So we found that in a pilot study that slowing down users' movements, or at least points where the slope of the curve is less than 1, felt kind of unpleasant, but that might have just been because we were doing it in a context of making people's movements more comfortable, specifically without alerting them to the fact that amplification was happening. But if people went into the whole experience knowing that amplification was, I guess input attenuation in that case was going to happen, people went into it knowing that it was going to happen, there could definitely be applications for, say, you have to reach the full way out, or you have to move a lot more rigorously to get any kind of actual in-game movement going. So I could see effectively flipping this graph upside down being an interesting way to allow people to, say, practice more, get more exercise by having to make much more exaggerated movements to accomplish the same things. So it's definitely an area for future work.
Okay, great answer. Another question or another feedback was, great presentation. How was this presented to participants prior to experiencing? So was it framed as an augmentation of the real capabilities, similar to work on exaggerated avatar flexibility in VR kickboxing?
So this is, to be honest, as amplification was happening, we actually didn't prime the participants at all. We just told them, you're going to have a task with the targets. You're going to click on some targets and let us know if you feel anything different, or if you experience anything that doesn't seem normal. So we tried our hardest not to tell them what to look out for or anything. So it wasn't, to be honest, we kind of tried to keep things on the down low. So this was presented to people as, in terms of how people notice amplification was happening, they would probably notice they have the standard setup of controllers in their hands and everything, but they would probably notice that the controller would be like moving more than they expect eventually. And that's usually what tipped people off.
Mm-hmm. Another comment was, great presentation. Do you think there's value in letting the user control amplification, similar to moving your finger up, down while scrubbing on iOS, even if it breaks immersion?
Oh, for sure. I'm imagining something like there's previous work on a depth casting technique. Basically, it's a ray case. In most cases, ray casting to select objects means that you're basically shooting an infinitely long laser pointer out to try and select objects. But you can actually scroll up and down to select the depth in this new technique. So being able to specifically say, I want to amplify my movements twice up would be an interesting way of doing things. But yeah, it would definitely come with that ownership trade-off. But I guess then you're also facing the question of, I notice that this is going on, but my experience is so much better. How much do I care? So I guess it's one of those design questions that we can come back to, like it's a balance of how much do people need to know versus how much do people want to move more comfortably.
Okay, so thank you for joining me today. Just one very last question. So the last comment was a great talk. Thank you. Is body ownership that important in VR? And is this really a problem to temporarily break it? Sorry, I asked this question, did I not? Oh, no, I did not. Okay, proceed. The other one was a little bit similar. Never mind. Go on.
Yeah, so I think that's a topic that's kind of debated by people in the kind of the VR community, depending on what the application are that they want, right? So I would suggest that say you're playing a video game and you need to feel like you're immersed in the scene and everything to have the same kind of, I guess, artistic experience with playing the game. In that case, I would probably say that body ownership is important. But say, I'm sitting at a desk and I'm doing, whatever the futuristic version of Microsoft Excel VR is. I guess in that case, I don't really need to have the feeling of, wow, I'm so immersed in this spreadsheet. So it's definitely a design question still. But I think there are a lot of cases in which body ownership is important, and playing with body ownership and maintaining it is still an interesting form of research, even if it's not necessarily needed in every case for VR.
Okay, thank you for your answer and thank you for joining us today. We will now be moving on to the second paper, Transport Me Away, Fostering Flow in Open Offices Through Virtual Reality by Anastasia Ruvimova.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Anastasia, and I'm from the University of Zurich. Today, I'm excited to present research done in a collaboration between the University of Zurich, University of Waterloo, and Virginia Commonwealth University. Take a moment to envision your ideal environment for working, one in which you're optimally focused, in the flow, and most productive. Perhaps it's an office with a view, a remote mountain cabin, an idyllic tropical beach. Just you, the waves, and no one else to distract you. The truth is, we oftentimes can't control our work environment, and the beach remains just a fantasy. So our researchers wondered, what if instead of putting the worker on the beach, we brought the beach to the worker? And we do this through technology familiar to many of you. Virtual reality. What was once known as a medium for gaming and entertainment has now expanded to areas as broad as pilot training and medicine. What if we extended this to the common workplace? By donning on the headset, the user physically remains at their desk, but is virtually transported to their idyllic beach. Our research question follows. How would VR affect a user's concentration and ability to get into flow, a state of full engagement and immersion in the task? To investigate this question, we introduced two virtual environments. The first is a Hawaiian beach, a serene nature environment which, from past research on biophilia, we believed should foster flow. The second is an open office filmed in 3D and made into a virtual environment. This served as a control to see if the virtual factor itself has an effect. Our study included two lab settings, our baseline closed office, where the participant was left alone to perform their tasks undisturbed, and an open office where two actors worked alongside the participant and performed a script of random actions, such as occasionally making conversation with each other, typing loudly, coughing, and other actions that you may see in an open office setting. In addition, we played a background tape recorded in an open office setting for a more crowded feel and reproducibility. This resulted in the following 4 conditions: our baseline closed office against 3 open office conditions, with no VR, with a virtual office environment, and a virtual beach environment. We know from past research that the closed office outperforms the open one when it comes to fostering flow and productivity. So how would our 2 virtual environments on top of the open office measure against these 2 traditional settings? We asked participants to play a programming game called Lightbot in each of the conditions. In the VR conditions, the game was displayed on a screen floating in their environment. The game was played with the computer mouse in each of the conditions. The goal of the game is to light up all of the blue tiles by building the correct sequence of commands. The tasks grow increasingly challenging and require the logical thinking found in a lot of knowledge work. We recruited 35 participants across 2 countries. For each, we recorded their ranking of the conditions by preference, the number of tasks completed in the allotted time, and their mental state as measured by the flow state scale questionnaire. So how did our 2 virtual environments on top of the open office compare against the traditional office settings? Can virtual reality really foster flow and minimize distractions? Mom, yeah, I'll be down to dinner in a bit. Let's get down to the results. In the follow-up interviews, we saw that the virtual beach and the closed office ranked much higher than the actual and virtual open office environments. Now remember that the 2 virtual environments were both run in the same open office lab setting, and yet we see this huge disparity in their user preferences. The virtual beach and the closed office environment were ranked as the user's first or second favorite over 80% of the time, as compared to the other 2 conditions with less than 5%. These results give hope that virtual reality with the right environment can create an experience that comes close to that of a closed office environment. For the task completion and flow scale, we didn't notice a significant effect, which may be due to some interaction effect in the task difficulty. The Lightball challenges were highly varied, making it difficult to compare against each other. However, we still saw some general trends, with the virtual beach and the closed office producing better flow than the other conditions. In addition, analyzing the 9 flow scale dimensions independently, we saw that the virtual beach was best at obtaining a challenge versus skill balance, which according to Csikszentmihalyi is integral to achieving flow. We saw some trends in the comments given by participants in the follow-up interviews. In the virtual office and the actual open office, participants complained about distractions and difficulty staying focused. When there were background noises or talking, that's when my mind was sometimes going back and forth. I have very good peripheral vision, so I have a hard time not looking up. In the virtual beach and the closed office, participants said they had a much easier time staying focused. In the beach VR, I could do a lot more, like fully concentrate. It was very easy to stay focused. This shows that virtual reality alone is not enough to create an optimal experience, that the type of virtual environment plays a huge role. It seems that the virtual beach in this regard was a successful environment. Participants had a lot of positive comments. For example, I was more focused with the beach, I would say. I didn't even notice you guys were there. It just affected my mood, sitting around the beach in some nature environment feeling, and then this way I could concentrate better. Now, virtual reality in the workplace is still a novel concept, and we don't expect it to be widely adopted in the industry by next year. However, as the workplace continues to modernize, technologies like virtual reality are a potential solution to bridging the gap between the common but crowded open office and the luxury of a private one. One of the strengths of virtual reality is its versatility. Everyone's ideal environment is different. Think back to the one that you envisioned for yourself. On top of a mountain, under the sea, in outer space, with VR, imagination is the limit. And not only can you tailor the environment to you as an individual, but even to your current task, your current mood, your current needs.
I do better.
No matter what your setting is, with VR, you can escape to your perfect environment. Thank you for your attention, and see you next time.
Hello, Anastasia. Great presentation.
Hello, thank you for having me, and I loved everyone's comments.
Yeah, people were entertained. So, first question. Someone asked, how do you make this accessible, especially for people who suffer from simulator sickness?
Yeah, simulator sickness is a really important issue here, especially when VR first came out with the resolution in these headsets made, nausea a really big problem. And as the headsets have been gradually improving over the years, this problem has been also improving bit by bit, but it's still far from being solved. Um, so this is at the same time something we are hoping that continues improving on the technological side. In addition, finding ways to, really plan and limit your time in VR. For example, perhaps to half an hour is important. So for people that are prone to motion sickness, VR sickness, this might be a solution that's only available, for small, limited hours during the day when they really have to focus on a task.
Great answer. Another comment said, great talk, and wow talk about timely research. And they had two questions. The first one being, I'm curious about your open office setting being the only one with other people in the space. And then they said, I think they weren't sure about that. And then they said, do you think that knowing other people were nearby, maybe hearing them work, might have had an impact?
Yeah, and I mean that's something that we were going after in terms of really creating that open office environment. So simulating that if you're in an open office setting, wearing a VR headset, you would have that same awareness of the people, nearby, even if you are immersed in VR. So that's definitely a side that we were interested in capturing, and that we tried to recreate with our actors.
Okay, great answer. The second question they asked was, do you think that people might have different preferences now after working remotely for a few months?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. Something we've been thinking about. Everyone is working from home. It almost seems like instead of escaping the office environment, they might actually want to, be put back into it. That feeling of, okay, I'm at work, I'm focused, like I'm doing work-related tasks as opposed to, in my bedroom, trying to hide from my kids or whatever the situation may be. I think this is also where the flexibility of the virtual environments plays a big role. So maybe the solution there is not to escape to a more, calming, relaxing environment. Maybe it is to be put into, something a little more, office themed, for example. But of course, this really depends on a person's situation. If they are, having to babysit kids at the same time, the virtual reality solution might not be the best one for that situation.
Makes sense. And now a question more specific to your when you did your research. So is there anything you would like to shed on about your methods section, shed light on?
Yeah.
Or how you collected the data, I guess.
In terms of collecting the data in general.
Mhm.
Yeah, so there were several aspects in that. So of course, like what we were really focusing the most on was people's experience. So those follow-up interviews were where we got really the most insights. So we sat down with each participant and talked through like what was their experience in each of the conditions, and especially when it comes to being focused, to being separated from the outside noises, visual distractions. So the majority of our data comes from these one-on-one interviews with the participants. But in addition, we did try to gather some quantitative data, for example, with measuring task time and having the participants answer these flow state scale questionnaires, which attempt to measure this principle called flow, which was founded by Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi in his psychological work. So those differences were not as significant, and this is likely due to the tasks being just so different that it was really difficult to compare the results of one task over another when like the difficulty just ranged so much. So I think in a follow-up study, we would choose tasks that are a little bit more comparable to each other. But with the qualitative section, we were pretty impressed with the results.
Well, that's great to hear, and thank you today, Anastasia, for transporting us away. But now we'll be moving on to the next paper. So next paper is Understanding Viewport and the World-Based Pointing with Everyday Smart Devices in Immersive Augmented Reality by Yuan Chen.
Hi everyone, my name is Chen. I'm a master's student at HCI Lab of the University of Waterloo, supervised by Keiko Caslagra and Edward Lang. Today, I will be presenting our paper Understanding Viewport and World-Based Pointing with Everyday Smart Devices in Immersive Augmented Reality. Pointing and selecting are foundational aspects of interaction in physical and virtual world, and personal smart devices have frequently been used as input devices. Previous work has contrasted a set of different pointing techniques using phone and watch to support distant pointing with external displays. Our initial goal was to replicate these aspects in AR environments because in these environments, it is often the case that users must interact with distant projected content. However, a challenge presented itself when adapting different pointing techniques using smart devices to AR. While distant pointing is a common task within AR environments, techniques for pointing remain fragmented across head-mounted displays. The use of specialized controllers, specialized gestures, and various tracking technologies all contribute to this fragmentation. More broadly, the input techniques can be segmented into two metaphors for head-mounted display environments, the world-based metaphor and the viewport-based metaphor. The world-based pointing metaphor allows the cursor to move independently of the head-mounted display, while the viewport-based pointing metaphor places the cursor within the viewport of the head-mounted display, and the cursor moves with the head rotation. So with these two pointing paradigms co-found, we want to answer three questions in this work. First, we want to know how these two pointing paradigms affect the selection performance in either AR or VR. Second, we want to explore how various pointing techniques and devices affect users' performance in AR and VR. Last, by answering these two questions, we want to know how to design efficient pointing techniques using smart devices in the immersive environment. But before we go into details of our work, let's take a step back and look at some related work. Viewport and world-based pointing have been widely used. With viewport-based pointing, users are aware of the cursor and can move it with head rotation, so researchers can design and evaluate multimodal techniques with head and gaze interaction. While in a world-based pointing paradigm, users can interact with objects even without looking at them. Phone and watch are also well explored in both physical and virtual environments as input devices. They can provide 6 degrees of freedom input for various interactions. Although many applications use viewport and word-based input metaphors and explores personal device interactions in AR and VR, our work focuses on explicitly comparing different types of pointing techniques using phone and watch with these two pointing paradigms. Our methods consist of three parts: pointing paradigms, pointing techniques, and selection. The first pointing paradigm is Viewport Center, which is a commonly used solution for target selection in many existing head-mounted displays. In Viewport Center, the cursor is always located at the center of the viewport, and its movement corresponds to a user's head rotation. In the context of the viewport boundary, the boundary is a band around the edge of the display. When a user's head is stable, a cursor inside the display can be repositioned by manipulating an input device. When the head moves slightly, if the cursor is within the boundary but not pushed by the boundary, the cursor stays fixed in position. However, if the head moves sufficiently far that the boundary pushes the cursor is pushed in the direction of head movement, such that it still stays within the boundary. Word is a word-based paradigm. In the word condition, cursor movement is independent of head movement and only relies on input devices for control. For pointing techniques using smart devices, there are three types summarized in previous work. The first type is relative touch-based technique, where cursor movement is relative to the finger's movement on the touch screen. The second is absolute touch-based techniques, where we map a user's finger location on the touch screen to a consistent position of the virtual cursor on either the viewport or the virtual wall. The third is relative rotation-based techniques, where we implement a fixed origin recasting, and the origin of the ray is located at the camera of the head-mounted display. We implement these techniques using phone and watch. To select targets, users simply need to tap on the touchscreen, except for rotation-based technique using smartwatch, where users need to rotate their wrist for selection. For a quick recall, we have three pointing paradigms, 5 pointing techniques, and 2 selection methods. We define pointing condition as the combination of pointing paradigms and pointing techniques, and Viewport Center plus tap is considered as the baseline in this study because it is commonly used as a baseline solution. To evaluate these pointing conditions, we designed the experiments as follows. We use fabric walls to create a cubic room and generate 4 virtual walls. Participants are asked to point at the targets following the provided instructions. We separate our experiment into 2 studies, one with smartphone and one with smartwatch, and evaluate these pointing conditions in 4 dimensions. In study 1, Viewport Center was significantly faster than other pointing conditions. By refactoring pointing condition into pointing paradigm and pointing technique, we found significant effects of pointing paradigm and pointing technique on completion time. Pointing techniques with viewport boundary are all significantly faster than those with word-based metaphors. Absolute touch-based techniques are all significantly slower than relative touch-based and rotation-based pointing techniques. While Viewport Center was faster than all other pointing conditions, it has much higher error rate and relatively high offset distance. Generally, pointing techniques with the word-based metaphor causes fewer errors and smaller offset than those with viewport-based metaphor. When looking at the Anastasia TX results, it shows that the viewport-based pointing conditions have lower touch slope than the word-based pointing conditions, and in fact that seems to hold regardless of the technique. When looking at the Fitts law, we notice that in the word perspective, When a target is generated outside the field of view, the continuous moving of the finger on the touch screen without knowing the position of the cursor will cause the cursor to exceed the target position multiple times, such that extra physical effort is needed to move the cursor back. Now, when we look at the user study 2, similar to study 1, Viewport Center is significantly faster than those other pointing conditions. Viewport-based pointing conditions are faster than or almost equal to the word-based pointing conditions. Again, considering both error rate and offset distance, the result is similar to that in study 1, with Viewport Center having the highest error rate but relatively low offset distance. The TRX results of study 2 show the consistent result as what study 1 shows. Viewport-based pointing have lower task load for all attributes than word-based pointing using the same pointing technique. We observe a very similar problem for touch relative input in word perspective for Fitts law. Because of the need to move the cursor a long distance, participants will lose track of the cursor, overshoot, and need to perform costly corrections. So what we can learn from these results, a straightforward interpretation is as follows. First, Viewport-based pointing techniques are faster, as accurate, and require less cognitive loads than the word-based pointing conditions. Second, with the same pointing paradigm, relative touch-based techniques are faster, more accurate, and have lower cognitive loads and lower offset distance. Third, relative rotation-based techniques have different performance across devices. Last, Viewport Center is faster but has higher error rate and offset distance. To design efficient pointing conditions, we should consider the following aspects. First, regarding the viewport-based versus word-based conditions, viewport-based techniques improve selection speed without sacrificing accuracy. Second, users feel less fatigued mentally and physically using viewport-based techniques. When we're considering the pointing techniques, conditions, and devices, Viewport Center is still the fastest technique among all conditions, but it causes more errors for general cases. In other words, hand control is better than head control in terms of accuracy. Relative touch-based techniques using phone and watch with viewport boundary viewing are good alternatives if targets are on virtual surface. If targets are generated in the air, rotation-based techniques using phone with viewport boundary viewing is then a good choice for control. We noticed that rotation-based techniques using smartwatches cause fewer errors and high offset distance, probably due to two reasons. First, we apply one-to-one mapping between device orientation and ray orientation. Second, we noticed that participants move their forearms more carefully and rotate their wrists more deliberately when they are select targets. In the future work, we want to replicate this work in VR environments with specialized controllers. We also want to study more complicated in AR environments, such as living room with furniture or a crowded classroom. We also want to explore capabilities of smart devices to achieve various tasks, such as proximal object selection and virtual object manipulation. To conclude, in this paper, we explore various phone-based and watch-based pointing techniques for AR interactions. We found that while equally accurate, viewport-based pointing conditions provide faster and low-fatigue input. We also demonstrate that modern smart devices are effective input devices in AR environments. As these personal devices expand in sensing capabilities, they provide an exciting platform to support rich input in head-mounted display interactions. For more details, please check our paper.
Constant, great talk.
Thank you.
Okay, so first question for the Q&A session. So someone said, I might have missed this, but why introduce the boundary concept? And why is it needed instead of just using the full viewport?
So why do we introduce the boundary concept? We conducted a series pilots before and we found that during the interaction, users expected that the cursor should respond to the head movement when they move the head using the lens. And this is for a very sufficiently large distance, but for very small distance, they assume that the cursor should stay at the same position and only manipulate using the input device. So with this pilot, also notice that from our own perspective, notice that if a cursor is very close to the edge of the viewport, it become very dimmed, and sometimes it is hard to track the cursor. We just design a boundary such that it is noticeable when we are wearing the AR headset, and it is easier and helpful for the participants to quickly identify where the target is and help them to quickly manipulate the cursor.
Answer. So what do you believe could be future uses for your findings and research?
I think one of the most important thing for this is we can see a great opportunity for using the input devices to use the smart devices like the phone and watch as input devices as the controllers for AR and VR headset. Because one thing here is that everyone has a phone now, and everyone potentially will buy a watch for different purpose. But we can see now if there are great opportunity, and as what I said in the video, and this smart device has increasing capabilities in sensing and multiple functions features, can better serve as a input proxy for interaction, such that we are with this in promising or future AR VR headsets, we can get rid of the controllers that we have nowadays and use these devices for control, and that can enable people to use this access everywhere in for example in the street or whatever, anything.
Hey, thank you. That was a great answer. So one last question, and then we'll wrap this up. So if you were to do your research again from scratch, what would you do differently and why? So basically, I just want to hear about what modifications you made along the way.
One thing, when I was doing the experiments, I noticed that there must be an improvement the experiment design. So what I did here, we designed actually two experiments, one in watch and one in phone, but we can actually modify a little bit with other factor, such that actually the results and the analysis will look nicer from my perspective. But I don't think it will change the results, but just definitely present the overall results clear. That's it.
Thank you, Constant, for joining me for this Q&A session and for your great presentation. We have reached the end of session 4. Next up is session 5 at 1:30. Thank you to all the presenters and the viewers for joining us today. Bye.